So we've just come off the back of a period of international rugby, and everyone is analysing how the state of various unions are, and some of those nations are in panic. But should they be? I'm kind of making this video because I want to talk about how I think international rugby is really hard to analyse, and it's really difficult to draw concrete conclusions. And the first thing I want to talk about is about sample size. We probably just saw teams play at most 6 games, but really it was sort of 4 or 5 games for most nations. That's not a lot of games to draw a reasonable conclusion from. In the NFL and in football, we kind of talk about how you probably need about 8 to 10 games to find out if a team is actually good or not. And that's not just using results, that's using underlying stats as well. Things like expected goals and expected points added that we don't have yet in rugby. It's very difficult to analyse behind the result yet. So we don't get a lot of games to look at. And that's the thing, is if you think about, say, a 3-test series, and I've kind of made a binomial chart of this, so using binomial expansions to get the probabilities of how often a team would win a series. So if a team's got a 10% chance to win a game, if you play 3 games, that's the probability it comes out. And, you can go into a 3-test series against 2 teams that are evenly matched. It's 50-50. Say, Ireland, Australia, I don't know if they are 50-50, but let's say, for argument's sake, they both have a 50% chance of winning. You could get a 3-test series where one of them comes out with a 3-0 whitewash, and it doesn't necessarily change things. They both just have a 50-50 chance of beating each other, but about 12-13% of the time, one of them will win that series 3-0. 25% of the time, one of those teams will win the series 3-0. And we'd probably analyse that and say, one team is in absolute chaos, whilst one team has just come off the back of a fantastic 3-test whitewash. And say if you take something like the Six Nations, where there's 5 games, if you had a 90% chance to win all those games, then you'd still only win the Grand Slam less than 70% of the time. And sometimes teams that are slightly worse than that will win the Grand Slam. It doesn't necessarily mean that winning the Grand Slam means you're the best team, because we have such a small sample size in there. If you do win the Grand Slam, it's more likely than not that you are the best team, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. I've talked about this before, about how one-score games as well aren't necessarily predictive, especially when you've got small sample sizes of things. And I think that England-France game in the Autumn Nations Cup final was a perfect example of this. If France gets some slightly different refereeing decisions, they win that game comfortably. If Owen Farrell has his cheating boots on, they probably England win that game comfortably. Those things aren't necessarily predictive. A different day, a different ref, France get those decisions. And we know that Owen Farrell isn't going to be a sub 50% goal kicker on most days. So it's difficult to say, because that game was really, really close. Say France would win it, well, it means England are bad and they'll never win another game. It's really difficult to draw too many conclusions just from one game. And this is kind of why I think World Cups are a really bad way to decide who's the best team in the world. And this is kind of a side point. But, when you have some really close games quite often, and it only comes down to one bit of knockout rugby, it's kind of difficult to say definitively the best team in the world. And I think the last World Cup's a really good example of this, is that England beat New Zealand beat South Africa, and South Africa beat England. If they all happen in a slightly different order, we end up with a different World Cup winner. If England and New Zealand are in the same group, England beat New Zealand, South Africa beat England in the semi-final, and then New Zealand beat South Africa in the final. It's difficult to necessarily conclude that one team is the best team in the world just because they win the World Cup. That doesn't necessarily mean the World Cup is bad. I love the World Cup. I'm just saying that we shouldn't necessarily use it to be like, they won the World Cup, definitively the best team. I think the other thing that makes international rugby hard to analyse is that passing of time, as well as having a small sample size. The way it is, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is you have the Six Nations, and then it's 3 months off, and then you have a summer tour, and then it's 3 months off, and then it's the Autumn Internationals, and then it's 3 months off, and then it's the Six Nations again. And so suddenly you don't play that many games, probably sort of 10 to 12 games, and quite a lot of time has passed. And it doesn't feel like that. You might just look back 5 games ago, and that could be 10 months. As if we looked at that in a domestic competition, you go back 5 games. That still it's quite recent. It's still got quite a lot of relevance on the games you're about to play. And things change. Not one thing we don't talk about that much in rugby, probably because we don't know a lot about it, is age curves and how players improve with age and also how they regress with age. In football, it's peak age is between 23 and 27. And in the NFL, we don't have that many old players knocking about just because of the way the NFL works, but it tends to work there that players that play in more space tend to regress quicker with age, which kind of makes sense and would hold to rugby that, things might get worse for wingers and fullbacks a lot quicker than they get for props and second rows. But age is still very much a thing, and players affected by injury can definitely regress. And this is why I think it's important in this video, particularly to highlight Wales. And when I talk about nations in panic, I mean Wales. New Zealand kind of, but mainly Wales. And it's because they came off the back of a very, very successful period, and now they seem to be having a much less successful period. But when you look at the Welsh players, a lot of their star players are getting much, much older. I'm a Bath fan, so I've got to watch Faletau, and he's not really lit it up for us whilst having quite a lot of injuries. And, injuries can mean a player regresses as well, but he's hit 30 now, and he might be starting to regress. Alwyn Jones is 35, Ken Owens, 33, Tipperick, 31, Halfpenny, 31, Jonathan Davis, 58. I mean, yeah, he's 32, but still, he's getting older. And it means that they probably are starting to decline. And so it means that Pivic doesn't necessarily have the same players that Gatland does. And even though we might be saying, well, why can't Pivic do what Gatland is doing with the same group of players? It doesn't mean they necessarily are exactly the same group of players. And Wales probably don't have the luxury of having a sort of production line of talent in the same way that England and New Zealand do. It might be that Wales just sort of hit on their golden generation whilst Gatland was in charge. Now, maybe we can say the rugby under Pivic hasn't been good, but they have lost 3 one-score games and only really been blown out once. Losing one-score games to England and France, I don't think is actually that bad. But it does look, when you look at the results, it is a sea of losses. And you could say, well, maybe Gatland was a master of winning one-score games, and he would have won those games, which is why the Chiefs lost all their one-score games in Super Rugby after 5 of them. And that goes the other way. Gatland probably got a bit of his good luck under Wales, where they won a lot of one-score games. And he maybe got his bad luck with the Chiefs. It's sometimes difficult to say that one-score games are necessarily predictive. And so I think that passing of time is quite a crucial issue that sometimes gets overlooked, that you're not necessarily dealing with the same amount of players because you might produce some fantastic youngsters and players do regress. And there's maybe a few other things I sort of wanted to talk about, but I think it's probably another deep dive of we don't really know how these teams in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere match up to each other anymore with the comparative strength, especially seeing as, we probably won't get a game between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere properly until the Autumn Internationals next year, which would be 2 years since some of them played each other. So it might be the Southern Hemisphere has gone on leaps and bounds, and the Northern Hemisphere has stayed stagnant. So a team like Australia and New Zealand, they might be thinking, oh, we've had a few rough results here, but then they might go and absolutely batter the Northern Hemisphere teams. We don't know. So that's probably something to maybe keep an eye on, especially in a COVID-affected world. But I think that's a complicated issue that is more just a bit. That might be a thing, kind of thing. Yeah, I'm glad I've made this. I haven't made a video in a long old while, mainly because that kind of lockdown blues. So I've not been as productive as I'd like, which is a shame. So this isn't the most sort of stat heavy. It's more just kind of a bit bloggy, It's a grand new media I'm experimenting with, the video blog. We shall call it the Blidio. Can you believe I got paid? I've been paid to do stand-up comedy. You wouldn't believe that, would you? But yeah, hopefully you enjoy it. Hopefully, like all these things, it's not definitive. It's just kind of like, hey, here's something to think about thing. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed making it, and hopefully I've got quite a lot of ideas to make some more. Will I? I hope so.